Most people think a bank account is a storage box you put money in, the bank keeps it safe, you take it out when you need it. That is the story almost everybody carries in their head, and it is wrong in a way that becomes expensive precisely when you can least afford to discover it. I want to start with a very uncomfortable sentence. A bank account is not a service relationship first. It is a permission structure first. That sounds cold because it is cold. When you open an account, what you are really doing is signing a document that defines what the bank may do, what it may delay, what it may offset, what it may restrict, what it may close, and how your money may become temporarily inaccessible even while it remains legally yours. That is the real architecture. Most people never see it because normal life never forces them to. The card works, the app works, the balance shows up, the transfers go through, nothing feels adversarial. That is what makes it so dangerous, because a permission structure that sleeps quietly in ordinary times often wakes up only in the moments you are under the most pressure. That is when the language you never read stops being theoretical. That is when it becomes operational. And if you keep anything close to $20,000 in a standard checking or savings account or anything approaching that amount, you should understand why that number matters, even though the public conversation around banking usually points you toward different numbers. People hear banking thresholds and think of the wrong triggers. They think of $10,000 and suspicious activity reports. They think of FDIC insurance limits. They think of tax law, they think of federal law stamping some famous number into the structure. That is not the real issue here. The $20,000 line matters for a different reason. It matters because of profitability. That is the line almost nobody sees. Banks do not think about you the way you think about yourself. You see your account as safety. They see it as a relationship, not a human relationship, a profitability relationship. If you keep a meaningful cash balance with them, but you do not carry a mortgage, do not revolve a credit card balance, do not use a line of credit, do not pay them in the ways they most prefer to be paid, then you become what many institutions effectively treat as a deposit-only relationship. And deposit-only relationships are not what most banks love most. That is because your money costs them. They owe you interest. They owe you infrastructure. They owe you operational support, digital servicing, fraud monitoring, statement generation, compliance burden, and all the machinery modern banking demands. To make that relationship attractive, they need to deploy your funds profitably somewhere else. That is the part depositors almost never meditate on. The money sitting in your account is not a static object in their eyes. It is funding, it is input, it is something they need to put to work at a spread that does not make banking evil. It makes banking banking. And once you understand that, the agreement you sign stops looking like paperwork and starts looking like a map of who has rights when the relationship becomes inconvenient. That is why I want to translate the map, because I have watched too many people assume they understood what a bank account was simply because they had used one for decades without incident. A person can go 20 years without reading a clause and conclude the clause does not matter. That is the same logic people use with fire insurance. They assume they do not need it because their kitchen did not burn down last Tuesday. The point of the clause is not daily visibility. The point is what happens when the condition arrives. And in a bank agreement, the conditions arrive faster than most people imagine. I want to walk you through the four mechanisms at the center of this structure. Not to make you paranoid, to make you precise. The first mechanism is the right of offset. This is where the difference between your mental model and the bank's legal model becomes obvious. Immediately, if you owe money to the same institution that holds your deposits. The institution may have the contractual right to take money from your account and apply it against what you owe. Now, most people hear that and imagine something dramatic: missed payments, collections, a lawsuit, a desperate situation. That is how the public imagines debt enforcement. The account agreements often imagine it more broadly. The language is what matters here, not your assumptions. The agreement usually says the bank may apply funds from an account you maintain with them to satisfy an obligation you owe them, and that wording is doing more work than most people realize. It is not only about default in the dramatic moral sense, it is about rights. If the bank decides the structure permits it, your money can move before you thought it needed to, and your notice can arrive after the fact rather than before the moment. That is not how most depositors think. Most depositors believe a savings balance is one thing, and a credit card or loan obligation is another. The document often treats them as connected through the institution's internal rights. That is the first fracture in the mental model. The money in your deposit account is not merely sitting there waiting for your decision. If you have created another obligation to the same institution, the rights are cross, linked. That matters more than almost anybody thinks, because life is full of moments when your deposit balance is there precisely to give you room. And discovering after the fact that some of that room can be reallocated by the institution is a very different emotional experience from reading about it calmly on page 37 of a document you never opened again. For years I treated this kind of clause the way most people do, as a legal formality, a background right that exists on paper and rarely matters to sensible people. Then I listened more carefully to how these situations actually show up, the calls that hit escalations departments, the customers who are not describing some wild corner case, but a routine category of surprise, the people who say the same sentence in different words. I didn't know the bank could do that. Whenever I hear the same sentence repeated by enough normal people, I pay attention, because repetition is how hidden structure reveals itself. That is why the right of offset is not a curiosity to me. It is a signal. It tells you the bank account is not a sealed box. It is one node in a wider permission network inside the same institution. Now let us move to the second mechanism. Funds availability again. The public has a story here. The money arrives, the balance goes up, the money is mine. Sometimes that story is mostly true. Sometimes the agreement gives the institution more room than the customer realizes. This is where the distinction between visible funds and accessible funds becomes very important. The balance can show one thing while the practical ability to move that money shows another. That gap is where stress lives. A deposit can appear on your statement and still be functionally restrained for a period of time under the agreement's old provisions. The timing matters. The reason matters less than the timing, because the hold does not injure you when everything is calm. It injures you when the money arrived because you needed it to do something, close a deal, cover an obligation, fund a move, handle a family problem, respond to urgency. That is when the difference between visible and available becomes real. And the cruel part is that this usually feels like a contradiction to the depositor. I can see the money. Yes, but I can use it. Also, yes, that feels absurd, only because most people were never taught the distinction. The document already knew the distinction. That is what I mean when I say the account agreement is a permission structure. You are not interacting with common sense. You are interacting with defined rights, defined exceptions, defined hold periods, defined operational privileges, and language written precisely enough to be enforceable and obscure enough to be ignored. That is not accidental. That is how modern agreements are built. Now, if you already carry a healthy balance and a large incoming deposit arrives, the practical experience can feel even stranger, because from the depositor's perspective, nothing about the account looks unusual enough to justify delay, but the agreement was not written to match your emotional sense of normalcy. It was written to preserve institutional discretion, that is, the real principle, discretion. And once you see that word clearly, banking becomes easier to read. The public wants certainty, the institution wants discretion. The agreement is where discretion gets written down and certainty gets quietly reduced. That is the second mechanism. Now we come to the third mechanism, and this is the one that produces the most immediate practical paralysis: account closure and return of funds. Most people never think seriously about how their money comes back to them. If the institution decides it no longer wants the relationship, they assume there will be a simple digital transfer, a wire, something instantaneous and modern. That is the public fantasy. The operational reality can be much more primitive. A paper check mailed, sent to the address on file, then deposited somewhere else, then subjected to the receiving institution, S-owned funds, availability rules. That sequence matters enormously, because when your account is closed, the issue is not whether the money is legally yours. The issue is whether your money remains practically usable during the transition. And if the answer is no for several days or even longer, then legal ownership becomes a very thin comfort. This is another place where ordinary language fails people. They say, "The bank returned my money." That sounds harmless, but if the return mechanism takes your liquidity and turns it into waiting, then what was returned was not full utility. It was delayed utility. And delayed utility can be extremely expensive in exactly the moments people need their cash to behave like cash. That is why I care so much about return mechanism. Not because account closure is an everyday event. Because when it happens, the form in which your money is returned becomes the entire story. Money that is moving through the mail is not money you can deploy in the next 10 minutes. Money waiting for the receiving bank, S-hold period, is not money that can solve an urgent problem tonight. Money that is legally yours and practically inaccessible is a category almost nobody builds into their mental model of what having money in the bank means. But the agreement did. That is the whole pattern. The customer carries one model, the institution operates under another. Nothing forces those models to meet until the event. And that is why the event feels like betrayal even when it is technically disclosed. Now, before I move to the fourth mechanism, I want to tell you the sentence that changed the way I think about all of this. The most dangerous financial assumption in retirement is treating a bank agreement like a service contract instead of a permission structure. I believe that deeply because those two mental models produce completely different behavior. If you think the agreement is mainly a promise of service, you will optimize for convenience. If you understand it as a permission structure, you will optimize for exposure. How much do I hold here? What else do I owe here? How quickly could I need this money? What assumptions am I making about instant access? What other institutions exist in my life if this relationship becomes constrained? Those are better questions. The average depositor does not ask them because the average depositor never had to, until suddenly he does. Now we get to the fourth mechanism, deposit reclassification. This is the most abstract one, and in some ways the most revealing because it shows you that the real life of your deposit account does not begin and end with the interface. You see, there is an internal world behind the visible world, a bookkeeping world, a categorization world, a reserve world, a balance sheet world, and movements can happen there without the customer seeing a visible trace in his daily experience. That is the part people resist emotionally. They think if nothing changed on the app, nothing of significance happened. That is a child's way of thinking about a bank. A bank is not an app. A bank is a regulated balance sheet that uses categories, reserve treatment, internal structures, and legal permissions to optimize itself continuously. Your account balance can look the same before bed and after breakfast, while the internal treatment of that balance inside the institution has changed overnight for reasons that matter to the bank and remain invisible to you. That does not mean the institution stole your money in the cartoonish way people imagine theft. It means the account you think of as static is participating in a dynamic infrastructure you are not watching. That matters. Because once you understand that, the depositor-bank relationship stops looking like a simple custodial arrangement and starts looking like what it really is. A managed liability on one side and a managed asset on the other. Your cash is your safety. Your deposit is their input. Those are not identical meanings. And if enough stress enters the system, every gap between those meanings becomes more consequential. That is what 2008 taught anyone who was paying attention closely enough. Not merely that banks can fail. That invisible legal and accounting architecture suddenly becomes visible through consequences when the environment gets rough enough. People talk about crises as though the crisis created new rules overnight. That is often not true. More often, the crisis reveals the rules that were already sitting there unused or unnoticed because ordinary conditions never forced them to the surface. That is what frightens people. Not that something illegal happened, that something fully legal existed in the background of a relationship they thought they understood. And this is where the $20,000 question becomes practical. I cannot give you one universal number and pretend to be honest. I cannot tell every person, never hold more than this amount in one institution, because the answer depends on too many variables. Do you owe that same institution money? Do you use the account for payroll? Are you retired and drawing on savings, or are you still accumulating? How quickly might you need the full balance? What other banking relationships do you maintain? Do you have a second institution ready if friction appears? Does your spouse know how the accounts are structured? These things matter. So I will not give you a slogan where judgment is required, but I will tell you what I believe. I believe the most fragile place to stand is in confident ignorance. I believe people with meaningful cash balances should know exactly what institution they owe, what institution they store, what rights are cross-linked, and what the practical access path looks like if the relationship becomes strained. I believe retirees are especially exposed to misunderstanding this because retirement makes liquidity emotionally and practically more valuable. A 35-year-old with a paycheck can survive an unpleasant delay differently from a 72-year-old who uses savings as operating capital for life itself. And I believe the safest move most people can make is not panic, it is literacy. Read the agreement, not the marketing summary. The real agreement, find the clause about offset or set-off, find the clause about hold periods, find the clause about closure and the method by which funds are returned. Read the part you have been paying a bank for years to never need to think about because the clause you have never read did not become relevant in the crisis. It became relevant the day you signed it. That is the sentence I would leave you with if I could leave you with only one. The only variable is whether you discover the permission before the institution exercises it. That is the whole difference. Before you still have options, after you have explanations, and explanations are one of the least useful forms of liquidity I know.